Okay, good afternoon everyone. I know it's hard to get back here after lunch and even harder to keep all of you awake, but I will try to do my best. So we have talked a lot about NTA transfers, time transfers throughout this conference. Most of those results are basically the product of the Agenta project. And also in Agenta, we have a specific work package which is devoted to look at retirement behavior and labor force participation at older age. That is our work package 3. So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to give you some overview of what we've done in looking at the retirement age and retirement behavior based on the Swedish register data. And in today's talk, I'm going to focus on labor force participation of older women. The reason is if we look at the literature in retirement studies, most likely we will end up in some title like retirement behavior of older men or labor supply of older men. But we seldom come across with a very specific study which investigates retirement behavior or labor supply behavior of older women. And one of the reasons for that, I guess, is in the past, the number of women who are still actively working, engaged in the labor market activities is relatively small, particularly at very high age, say 65. But over time, things has changed a little bit. So if we look at the year 1980, we see a very noticeable gap in average retirement age between men and women. However, this gap has been kind of diminishing over time, and until around the year 1994, both men and women has increased their effective retirement age up until today. So one question about this, when we look at this trend, one question we should ask is why there is a trend, because that's quite relevant for the future labor supply, particularly the future old age labor supply. And one very obvious candidate explanation for this is the notional defined contribution pension reform, which happened in year 1994 in Sweden. Well, in that year, it wasn't implementation of that reform, but rather it was the government passed legislation saying that Sweden will switch its pension system from an old defined benefit called ATP to the new one, NDC. And so give you a very brief account of what NDC essentially does. So NDC was implemented in around year 2000 and affected the birth cohorts from 1938 onwards. And the way NDC affects different birth cohorts, it's kind of cohort-specific treatment. So every cohort will be affected. Their pension income will be affected slightly different. For instance, for those born in 1938, 20% of their total pension will be calculated based on the new NDC system. The remaining 80% will be still in the old system. And the 1954 cohorts onwards, 100% of their pension will be calculated based on the NDC system. So what does this imply to the pension benefits? So for those cohorts, 1937 cohort here, they are not affected at all. But for the 1938 cohort onwards, we see their pension benefits has been reduced. And there are two important features. First important feature is for women, we see there is actually for the 38 and 39 cohorts, and even 40 cohorts, there's actually a slightly gain in their pension benefits. And in general, men lose more in their benefits compared to women. So one question is, to what extent the increase in retirement age we observed during past 2 decades can be explained by this change in the pension system. So I've done some analysis in my previous work, and I found out that for men, roughly about 1/3 of the total increase can be attributable to this pension reform. But what's surprising is, if we look at women, because we see the trend for women is more or less the same for men, but the percentage of the increase can be explained by this pension reform was only about 5%. So it's a surprising result, but the next question is, what actually drives the remaining 95% of the increase? What's the factors can explain this trend increase? So then I was thinking about, because okay, the reform happened. The reform was basically announced in 1994 and happened in 2000. But what about these cohorts? Think about a little bit further back in their life course. Was there any change in their education, average education attainment? And we all know that around the 1950s, there was education expansion, which is pretty much in a lot of places around the world. And in Sweden, that was a huge expansion, not only in terms of the enrollment rates in university, but also in terms of the increase in the number of higher institutions, higher education institutes. So this figure basically shows us that for all these cohorts who are affected by the 1994 pension reform, they are also experiencing a huge increase in their university education attainments. At the same time, their labor force participation was rising. And by the way, the labor force participation rates here we are talking about is the average between age 60 and 67. So then, again, another question is, somehow education and labor force participation is somehow related. But what is the mechanism? Why highly educated or younger cohorts become more educated, they work longer? What is the incentives or mechanism there? So one possible mechanism is basically the direct effect of education on labor supply. Could be the preferences, could be highly educated or younger cohorts, they are more educated, then they are engaged in those jobs which are probably a little bit more fulfilling or more exciting, which retain them in the labor force longer. It could also be due to some indirect kind of path. So according to Heckman, in his notion on the life cycle human capital story, higher educated, if we think higher education is kind of initial endowment before you enter the labor market, then higher education implies that you probably have a higher earning capacity, your wages might be higher, and higher earning capacity could increase labor supply through the intertemporal substitution effect. So these are kind of the two mechanisms that might shows the mechanism, might explain why higher education leads to higher labor supply. So if first thing we did is we look at the relationship between education and earnings, because the indirect mechanism really requires there has to be some increase in earning capacity. And what we do see is earning capacity and education are positively associated. And then we did some decomposition analysis, trying to see how much education, the rise of the education attainment contributed to the average increase in their earning capacity, and then how much the earning capacity contributed to the overall increase in labor force participation. So these equations are a little bit messy, but the last one, the second term of the last equation exactly shows you the direct effect of education on labor force participation, and The third term shows the effect of education on labor supply through the indirect mechanism, namely through the earning capacity increase. So here's the result. Again, a little bit surprising. What's surprising is, for male, this mechanism basically only explains very, very minor part of the overall increase. But for women, however, the indirect mechanism explains roughly 20% of the overall increase in the old age labor force participation. So, kind of, to summarize a little bit, older women's labor force participation, as we see, increased to more or less the same extent as older men, but the mechanism is slightly it's quite different than older men. Namely, for women, they increase their retirement age largely due to, for men, they increase their retirement age largely due to the reduced pension benefits. However, for women, it's somehow related to the increased earning capacity, and earning capacity is partly driven by the increase in their human capital. So the last word I would like to say is the key message from these results probably is keep educate yourself. That might be the key to sustain or improve your earning capacity. Thank you.
Okay, so it was very quick. Any questions? Well, I have to put it on. Yes?
Any questions?
Yeah. Thank you.
Probably I missed something. Where did the change in the pension system enter into your equation?
No, not in this one, not in these results. It didn't enter into the equation in this particular analysis.
So how could you then say that it's the change in earning capacity and not the change in the pension system that drives women's increased labor force participation?
Well, I'm not saying it's not. In previous work, what I've done, published in 2016, I showed how much this increase is attributable to the pension change for women, which is only 5%. So in this work, I was trying to further understand what other factors might drive this increase for older women. So in this particular analysis, what I show is how much this can be explained by the increase in women's average education attainment.
I wonder whether over this period there was a reduction in, say, labor force discrimination against, labor market discrimination against women, or an increase in returns to human capital due to changes in policy in the general environment.
I'm not sure about how much the discrimination part has changed over that period. I might need to look into that. But obviously there is an increase in return to human capital for women. Wage has increased, earning capacity has increased.
So is that what are you taking into account both the increased human capital and the increased return to human capital over this period?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically what I call the earning capacity in this paper is the average wage between age 56 to 59. And then I look at their average labor force participation between age 60 to 67. So I use that part of the wage as a indication of earning capacity, and there's a clear cohort trend in that earning capacity. So I suppose it is kind of the indication of increased return to schooling too.
Okay, thank you.
just have a short comment. Perhaps this is Swedish data, no? Perhaps you could try with share, because according to your results, women value more leisure in a way. So in share you have also time spent in care, so you could cross-check if this is due to that or... Okay, no more questions? You want to say something? Okay, so we go to the next presentation.